Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Ron Ketelsen, and I'll be your host for this evening. And I'm just trying to do several things at once here, so bear with me. And I am the president of the Sharon Historical Society. We're really excited to be offering this new series of historical lectures. They've been extremely successful for us. We started it new this year, and we have had we started when we had our meetings in person, about 20 people. When we went live, we have now over 2,000 people on our mailing list. Tonight, we had people registered from 38 states and 7 foreign countries. So we're really excited to have everyone here. A couple of things before we begin. There is a chat button down at the bottom of your screen. And when you need to chat or type something in, go to the bottom of the screen and click on that chat button and go ahead and type. I'm going to ask you a couple of times during the presentation to respond. And when you do, just hit chat and click on OK, and it'll show up on the screen. So I'm going to take myself off the screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So the Statue of Liberty is now open again to the public, but many of the people are not traveling yet, so I'm glad that you're joining us. We're going to show you some. I'm going to put my screen into full screen mode here. There we go. Well, here's some beautiful photos of the Statue of Liberty. And although it wasn't her formal name, it's actually Liberty Enlightening the World. And we'll discuss a little bit later how that name played into the actual design. But it's interesting to see how she looks at different times of the day. You can see on the right, you can see at the bottom, you can see the night and how the lights of the city reflect onto her and give it a completely different look from the daylight on the left-hand side. So it's really interesting to watch the different colors. Just a rough idea of the outline that we're going to be talking about tonight. We'll start with some questions, with a question that I'll answer. You don't have to do it just yet, but I'd like to ask you in a minute what the Statue of Liberty means to you. Then we'll be moving into some of the details about how was the statue conceived, how was it designed, the building of the Statue of Liberty. That will obviously lead us into who paid for the Statue of Liberty. It was an expensive gift, but it was still had some expense to it, so we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the opening day of the Statue of Liberty. We'll discuss some of the symbolisms of the statue, and then we'll talk about the saga of the torch of the Statue of Liberty. And then there's a new Statue of Liberty that is being presented to the United States, and we're going to learn a little bit about that. And then finally, we'll talk about how many Statue of Liberties actually exist in the world. So that's a few of the things. So let's talk about what the Statue of Liberty means to you. So what I'd like you to do is go down to the chat box below, and in 10 words or less, type in something in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share a video with you of the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. This was shortly after it had been restored. So let's.
And now we will unveil that gallant lady. Thank you, and God bless you all. Nancy.
So I saw some of the answers that you typed in the chat box, and it's just some really great ones. A symbol of liberty and closeness with France, freedom for all. Some people said it would give us memories of family trips, acceptance for all people, no matter where they're from, freedom to people from all over the world. A lot of the words freedom you hear, cherished ancestry, history. A symbol of America is a shining light in the world. To everyone, liberty and freedom. So, an interesting thing, there are several people that had mentioned immigration, hope to immigrants for a better future. And I noted that, when some of you did note immigrants, and some of you might have even remembered some of the music that was playing earlier, that it referred to give us you're tired, you're poor. That we're going to be talking about that poem by Emma Lazar in just a little bit. Lazarne. But actually, the Statue of Liberty had nothing to do with immigrants. That's what most people today associate with the Statue of Liberty. So before we began, let's take a look at where the statue stands in the harbor. And this is the New York Harbor. I might ask a couple of you who have your video on, if you wouldn't mind turning your video off, because I'm seeing that some people are thinking it's a little distracting. So just go down in the bottom of the left-hand corner and type in, and just click on the stop video button, and that'll take it off, and also stop the audio as well. So here's a map of New York Harbor, and on this map, there's two islands that you see. Almost on the New Jersey side of the harbor, you'll see Liberty Island, and just past that is Ellis Island, which is the location of the National Immigration Museum. But we're actually going to focus on Liberty Island right now, and it's interesting to note that Liberty Island was not always called Liberty Island. During the Dutch times, and even before that, when this area was inhabited by Native American Indians, the island was often referred to as the Great Oyster Island because of the abundance of oysters in and around the New York Harbor area. Well, once the British took over, the island's name was changed to Bedloes Island in 1667. And even though the statue had been on the island since 1886, the name only changed to Liberty Island in 1956. Back in 1924, the Statue of Liberty was declared as a national monument by President Kelvin Coolidge. In 1937, the War Department renounced control of Bedloes Island because it used to be a fort, and they renounced control, and then the National Park Service began to redevelop the island to complement the statue. And then in 1956, as I said, Bedloes Island was renamed Liberty Island. So let's go on and let's talk about some of the statistics of the statue. It's mostly hollow inside. The total weight of the statue is about 450,000 pounds. You'll see that it's 151 feet and 11 inches from the base to the torch. The thickness is actually the thickness of 2 copper pennies. It's 3/32 of an inch. When there's a lot of wind, it sways back and forth. In a 50-mile-an-hour wind, it can sway as much as 3 inches, and the torch can sway as much as 6 inches in the wind. The torch was replaced in 1986. It's copper covered with gold leaf, and we're going to spend a little bit of time later talking about that torch and like I said, the saga of the torch. So just some interesting statistics as we get into it a little bit. All right. My screen is freezing. There we go. Now, this shows you how the Statue of Liberty stacks up against other structures in the world in terms of height. So the top row will show you a comparison of other statues in the world, And the bottom row shows you how tall it is in comparison to famous buildings in the world, and including the Empire State Building. And you'll see the Empire State Building on the bottom right. It's about 3 times as tall as the Statue of Liberty. But you know, we really can't just talk about the Statue of Liberty in terms of numbers. She's actually a symbol, and the answers you put in the chat box show us how emblematic it is to all of us. It represents much more, as you say, liberty and freedom. So let's talk a little bit about how the Statue of Liberty came to be. Well, it was actually the idea of this gentleman, who was a French writer and a politician. And he had the idea to create a monument to American liberty, celebrating the friendship between the American people and the French people. So I'm not very good at French, so I'll tell you that. So de la Boulaye came up with an idea in about the 1850s. And during this period, the French were not living in freedom. It was during the reign of the Emperor Napoleon III. So he was making a bit of a statement by saying that our friends on the other side of the Atlantic were living in freedom and democracy, and why can't we? Well, the United States was the Statue of Liberty was a gift to the United States, and it was a symbol of liberty and freedom. So those of you who responded with that were absolutely correct. The other thing that de la Boulaye was trying to get across was he was a staunch abolitionist who was against slavery in the United States. And even though he never set foot in the United States, and he died in 1883, 3 years before the Statue of Liberty would be opened in New York, he wrote many magazine articles and pamphlets that were circulated around the United States, speaking out against slavery. So the statue is a bit of a celebration for the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War. And let's see here. There we go. So La Boulaye came up with the idea, but he didn't know anything about how to make it happen. So he publicized the idea and got the attention of many sculptors, French sculptors, who wanted to be a part of this project. And one of those individuals was Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who was so persistent that he be chosen for this project that he almost began stalking La Boulaye to gain his attention. And Bartholdi was even as a kid, was impressed by huge, large statues. Particularly the statue of the Colossus of Rhodes, which, as you can see, is on the left. And Bartholdi designed several large statues, many of them which were never built. But he just loved the oversized statues. And the example on the right was never built, but this was actually a design of Bartholdi. It kind of looks like the Statue of Liberty, but it's actually not. It was actually designed by Bartholdi for a lighthouse entrance to the Suez Canal in Egypt. Well, he pitched that idea, but somehow it was never accepted. So when de la Boulaye came along with the idea of the American liberty, Bartholdi said, well, I've already got a design that might work, something we could start with, and we could tweak it quite a bit to become uniquely American. So this was all taking place in about 1869 and 1870 in France. Well, in 1871, Bartholdi came over to the United States to pay a visit. And he did this for a couple of reasons. First, he wanted to talk to the American government about where to put this big monument. You know, there was a lot of discussion over where should it go. Should it go in the middle of the United States? Should it go on a coast? The idea was not actually settled until 7 years later when an act of Congress selected Bedloe's Island. So there was quite a bit of controversy over where it should actually be located. And several other cities had bid for it, including like Philadelphia. They wanted to have it located there. Well, the story goes that Bartholdi sailed into the New York harbor, and he saw the island for the first time off the deck of his ship, and And at that time, it was still a fort. It was an army installation called Fort Wood. Well, the photo in the upper left-hand corner shows one of the few photos that's in existence of the cannons at Fort Wood. And the fort was no longer being used. It was one of 5 forts that were built to protect the New York harbor during the war in 1812. But the other reason Bartholdi came to the United States was to gain inspiration and to build the Statue of Liberty. He traveled around quite a bit to gain insight before he went back to Paris and started to design and build the actual statue. Well, as you can see, there are various clay models that Bartholdi originally used when he came up with the final design. Many of these models are on display now at the Statue of Liberty Museum today. You can see how the design actually evolved. You can see that the design in the upper left-hand corner looked more like the Egyptian design, and how it evolved to the final design at the bottom right-hand corner. Now, I mentioned that it sits on an island in the middle of the harbor. Initially, there were ideas to have it sit in the very southern tip of Manhattan, in Battery Park, which is it's known today. However, Bartholdi was a strong advocate to have it sit on Bedell Island, and eventually his idea won out, and the statue was built on what was eventually known as Liberty Island. The scale shows you the grandeur and that was imagined by the designers of the statue. So it's quite large in comparison to the island. So Bartholdi headed back to France to start building the statue. And whatever designs he built of clay were only about 4 foot tall. The actual statue, as I said, was 151 foot tall. So how did they get the actual full-size statue built? Well, the real construction of the statue took place in a firm in Paris called Gutson, as I said, I'm not very good in French. It was a company in Paris, and this is where the initial Statue of Liberty took place, or work took place. The actual statue design was assembled and built in Paris. Then it was dismantled and put in shipping crates and was all shipped over to the United States to reassemble it in New York. Well, how do you go about doing design work in the days before computers and calculators? You know, all the work had to be done by hand. And basically, the 4 plaster models that were designed were made bigger each time. So they kept enlarging them and making them bigger. Every time they made a larger model, it required a minimum of 9,000 mathematical calculations. So again, that was all done by hand. It was quite an undertaking taking into account the limited technology that was available at the time. So each model was made of a wooden structure, and then it was covered with plaster. So you can see how the picture in the top, those are all wooden pieces, and they were all cut out and assembled together, and then they came along and covered them with plaster. Well, you can see in these photos just how massive the actual final structure was. You can see on the right how large the torch was in relationship to the model design down at the very bottom where that man is standing beside the torch. So they had to take it from a very small scale to a very large scale. How did we get the copper for the actual interior of the statue? Well, it was an ancient method that was used for bronze and copper statues called the Repose Method. It's loosely translated from French to English, which means pushed up. And once the 151-foot plaster model of the statue was actually built, the wooden frames were then built in the shape of the statue. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, they would then take the thin layers of copper. As we discussed earlier, it's the thickness of 2 copper pennies. They placed that inside the wooden forms, and then they used those big mallets, and they hammered the copper into place to take the shape of the actual statue. So copper is very bendable, especially when it's thin. So once it's hammered into shape, the skin was peeled out of the mold and then ready to assemble as the actual Statue of Liberty. This is a method that's been used for centuries to build bronze and copper statues, but never on a scale of this size before. So it was really quite remarkable that they were able to do this and make it work. Well, now you have this very skinny outer structure. So Bartholdi and his committee needed an engineer to design the inside of the structure to hold it up. And they hired this gentleman, Eugene Vallet de Lac. And he was one of the great 19th century architects, and the man who was responsible for preserving and restoring some of the greatest monuments in France that had fallen into disrepair. Most notable was the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Well, now originally Delac wanted to fill the inside of the statue with stone or masonry. As you can see in the picture on the right, that would have been a really bad thing, because in New York, with the wind and temperature as it changes, it needs to sway with the wind, and with the cold weather, it needs to expand and contract with the temperature changes. So if the statue had been filled as they had actually planned, it would have been built with either some sort of concrete or masonry, and it would have cracked early on. It would have been, require major fixes. So as it turned out, Delac was an old man, and he died. He actually died of natural causes before the interior design was finished. So the committee had to go and find a new engineer. And they turned to a man whose name sounds very familiar, Gustave Eiffel. And you may recognize that name from the man who went on to design the Eiffel Tower several years after he designed the Statue of Liberty. Well, Eiffel threw out the masonry design, and he decided to build the interior core with iron and steel, and then basically had the skin of the outside attached to the structure. Well, it was actually known as a curtain wall construction, where the weight of the core construction was supported by the iron and the steel, and the inside of the structure was just the weight of its own material. The outside of the structure was just the weight of its own material, not holding the entire weight of the structure. So it was a much better way to construct the statue. So once all of the design work was finished, it was time to put the statue together in Paris. And from the time of conception until the statue was actually put together in Paris was a period of 14 years, from 1871 to 1884. So it was quite a long time. But the statue in Paris was actually known as the Lady in the Park. And this was actually constructed in a park. And as you can see in this picture, in all of the pictures, they have scaffolding all around the structure. But interestingly enough, you can see those buildings in the back. Those were actually apartment complexes. And can you imagine living in the apartment complexes and watching that huge statue rise over the course of 3 years? It would have been really interesting to watch. Well, here's the schematic of how the interior was put together. It actually had 9 levels. And you can see from some of the imagery of the inside, we'll look actually inside what today it looks like on the inside. But the main image on the left is looking from the east, or the rear of the statue. So when did it come over here? It was brought over, and we're going to talk about how it got here. But on July 4th, 1884, the deed to the statue was given to the Minister of France, Levi Morton, which basically meant that the statue was done on the French side, and they were ready to send it over to their friends in the United States. However, as you can see, you'll see in a few minutes, that was only the beginning of a few problems and challenges in terms of getting the statue moved and reassembled here in the United States. On June 17th, 1885, a ship carrying the Statue of Liberty arrived in the New York harbor on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Well, the statue was sent over in 350 pieces in 214 shipping crates. And when the ship arrived in the New York harbor, about 200,000 people came out in the rain to see the statue arrive. Well, the Americans were very disappointed because all they saw was a clipper ship and a bunch of shipping crates on it. And they were expecting to see the statue put together just laying down on the deck. So it was a little bit of a shock to them to see nothing but shipping crates. Well, once they got it here, they had to have something to put it on. And the pedestal was designed separately and had nothing to do with the actual the statue. However, Bartholdi hired architects to design the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He hired probably one of the most famous architects in the United States in the 19th century, a man by the name of Richard Morris Hunt, who went through several designs with Bartholdi. One of the Native American feel, you can see that on the left. The one in the middle had kind of an Egyptian feel to it. The one on the right had more of a Roman feel. But eventually they ended up blending the designs together and coming up with the one that you see today. Well, the base was made of granite, and it was used to build a pedestal. The granite did not come from France. Actually, the granite was quarried in Connecticut. The copper for the statue was not from France either. It was obtained from Norway and was shipped to France to be shaped into the covering for the Statue of Liberty. Well, much of the work to build the pedestal to hold the statue was done by immigrants, as was most of the reconstruction on the U.S. side. Now, it's interesting to note that when the statue was built in France, it was surrounded by scaffolding, as I showed you in those pictures. It had scaffolding all the way around it. However, when it was reconstructed here in the United States, you can see from the drawings that on the drawing on the right-hand side, the statue was actually built with cranes and derricks from the inside of the statue. And the workers actually had to hang out from the top of those cranes and hammer and bolt the coverings into the frames. Well, that work was all done by hand. They had no power tools. But you know, it's amazing there was not a single loss of life during the entire building of this statue in the United States. Of course, this was before the days of OSHA and other regulatory agencies, which would, and you'd never get away with that kind of stuff today, but this type of construction had to do with two factors. There was limited room at the base of the statue, so they could not put all that scaffolding down there. So it was somewhat limited there. And so the other was cost savings. It was much cheaper for them to go this route and put the cranes and the derricks and lower the people down to do the work. So interesting. Well, funding for the Statue of Liberty, who paid for it? And it, you know, how was that all put together? Well, from the beginning, it was decided that the actual statue part, which was the green part, the copper part, as we know it today, would be paid for by the French. And the United States would be paying for the pedestal to hold the statue. Well, the money was raised relatively in a relatively short period of time to pay for the actual statue on the French side. They raised about 2 million francs in 1880s money, which would have been about $400,000 US money at that time, to pay for the actual construction of the statue. So how did the French raise the money? Well, no money from the actual French government was used. It was all from citizens and governments around France, and they had various fundraising efforts. As you can see on the bottom left, that's actually a napkin holder. At first I thought it was a ring, but that was a napkin holder, and they sold napkin holders as one of their fundraising ideas. In the center, there's a bookmark that was sold to raise money. There were raffles. They had dances to raise money. The head and torch of the statue sat in a park in Paris, and for an admission fee, you could climb up to the inside and look around. So the fundraising in France went pretty much according to plan. However, here in the United States, it wasn't. It was a little bit of a different story. Fundraising issues were a problem from the beginning. People did not understand why if they were given a gift from France, why they should have to pay for the other half. They thought France should pay for everything. Well, once the steps were taken to send the torch to the torch of the Statue of Liberty to the United States in advance, they thought, well, maybe that would raise some interest and help raise money for the base of the statue. Well, in 1876, the torch and the arm arrived here, and it was first put at the World's Fair Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. Well, it remained there for a year, and then it was sent up to New York, where it spent the next 5 years on the corner of 25th Street and 5th Avenue in Madison Square Park. People would pay an admission fee to climb up to the top and look around. And in 1884, when the statue was completed, the arm and the torch was then sent back to Paris to make sure that it would fit the rest of the statue. It was eventually all sent back to the U.S. in 1885 and then opened to the public in 1886. So if you can imagine the expense of putting that up and taking it down and sending it back over to Paris and then sending it back over here again, there was a lot of work and expense that went into that. Well, there still was not enough money raised in the United States to pay for the base of the statue. More fundraising efforts were needed, and the book on the left was actually a coloring book. It was sold to both children and adults, and there was also an art exposition that was held by the Brooklyn Arts Association to raise money. And we'll learn about this in just a little bit. Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem that we'll talk about, actually wrote that poem. She was commissioned for this art exhibition, and was commissioned to write the poem for that at that time. A lot of the fundraising efforts were aimed at the wealthy, and whoops, I must have skipped a slide here. Where did it go? I missed it. Well, anyway, it was aimed at the wealthy, and there was a certificate that it was supposed to be here, showing that someone had donated $5,000 to get the base of the Statue of Liberty completed. But all of those failed, and by the time the Statue of Liberty arrived in New York City in 1885, all that was built of the pedestal was demonstrated by just a small part of the foundation. So that was as high as the pedestal had been built, and the U.S. committee was completely broke. They were the committee that was supposed to be raising the funds. They were down to their last $1,000. So needless to say, the magazines and newspapers had a heyday with that, and they would print images like you see on the left, showing the statue as a shriveled up old lady, as it would appear at the time the pedestal would finally be finished. This was kind of embarrassing for the United States. It became worldwide news, and here we received it as a gift from France, but we had nowhere to put it. So, a little bit embarrassing. But how did we get out of this dilemma? Well, this one man stepped up to save the day. This was the great newspaper publisher, Joseph Pulitzer, and his newspaper was the New York World. Pulitzer never let an opportunity for publicity go by, so when he heard that the Statue of Liberty was in trouble and he sensed an opportunity to promote his newspaper and its circulation, he jumped right in. So he thought, well, maybe he could help get this statue built. So what did he do? Well, he created what was called now the very first Gofundme page campaign in the American history. He said that if people would send money in for the statue, he would print their names in the World newspaper, similar to what Facebook or a GoFundMe page does today. Well, it worked. And over 200,000 people sent money in for the construction of the pedestal for the base. Most sent in less than $1, however, but the effort was kicked off in March of 1885, and by August of 1885, they had raised more than $100,000, which was enough to complete the pedestal. All totaled, the money spent on the U.S. side for the pedestal was a little more than $250,000, and that was back in 1885. As soon as the money started to come in, they started construction on the pedestal because the statue was here and they had no place to put it, so they wanted to get started on it right away. Well, from there, it was a pretty quick construction job. It took 16 months for the statue to be completely built, and it was ready for opening day on October 28, 1886. It was basically like putting together a large jigsaw puzzle. They had over 300 plus pieces to put together. You just had to match up all the right parts and the right pieces and then bolt it all together. So they had a big opening day, and they had a huge celebration in New York, and people came from all over for this grand opening and to see the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty. And there were actually two parts of the celebration. The first part of the was a huge parade, and it started at Madison Square Park and then went all the way down to Lower Manhattan to the Battery, to the southern tip of the Manhattan Island. Well, it made one slight deviation around City Hall to go up Park Row to go past the World Building because Pulitzer was so instrumental in getting the funds to complete the base of the statue. So this was the very first of what would be known as the ticker tape parades, where people would throw confetti out windows as the parade went by. The parade was planned, but the actual ticker tape part of it was not. Well, the story goes that young office boys were working in those offices. They were about 12 or 13 years old, and they were really kind of upset because they were not given the day off to attend the parade. So to make a nuisance of themselves, they started throwing the ticker tape, the stock tapes out the window. Well, lo and behold, everyone loved the way it looked. And it actually started a trend. And there's been actually 206 ticker tape parades in New York City since. And this was the very first one. Well, as you walk along Broadway today, there's plaques that are on the sidewalks, and there's actually 206 of them. There's ticker tape noting the date and what the event was. And this goes all the way back to the very first dedication of the Statue of Liberty in 1886. I think the last one that they had, the last two that they had were actually for the World Cup, the Women's World Cup Soccer, were the last ones that they had. So I don't even think that they allow them anymore because it's such a mess to clean up. Well, after the parade, dignitaries were invited to Bedloe's Island, and about 2,000 people were invited to the island. And you can see the very fancy engraved invitation on the left, which was actually designed by Tiffany Studios. And on the right is one of the programs that was sold at that time for 25 cents a piece. Well, amazing thing happened on the way to the opening of the statue. Speeches were given by a few of the dignitaries at the end, and a speech was to be presented by President Grover Cleveland. Well, there was a huge French flag that was hanging over the face and covering the Statue of Liberty. And there was a man in the crown of the statue, and he was holding a rope to the flag, and his assistant was down on the ground level. And the assistant was supposed to signal him when the speeches were finished so that the man in the crown could pull the rope and the flag would come down and the fireworks would go off. Well, it doesn't always go as planned. And there was a speech being given by the chairman of the American Committee, who had been the Attorney General and Secretary of State, and at the time was one of the senators in New York State. And at one point in his speech, he made a big dramatic pause. Well, the assistant thought that was the end of the speeches, and so he signaled up to the man holding the rope, who couldn't hear the speeches, because you have to remember back in that time they didn't have amplification. So the man in the crown pulled the rope, and the flag came down, and the fireworks went off for almost 15 minutes. Well, as you can imagine, President Grover Cleveland wasn't too thrilled because he hadn't given his speech yet. So they had to gather all the people back up and listen to his remarks. So again, as I said, things don't always go as planned. Another interesting thing to note at the time, of the 2,000 dignitaries who were invited to attend the ceremony on the island, only 2 of them were women. One was the designer's wife, and the other was the French Prime Minister's granddaughter. Well, this was in the early days of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, and the women were not very happy about this, that they weren't invited. So what did they do? Well, they went out and they rented boats, and you can see at the bottom, they rented these boats and they went all around the island, and they held up signs protesting that women were not included. And there's still today some debate that some of these women actually distracted the committee chairman, and that's why he made the pause, and that's what caused the flag to come down early. So I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what the legend is. So we mentioned the immigrants earlier. Well, as I said, it was never the intent of Bartholdi and de la Boule to become a symbol of immigrants and to earn the nickname the Mother of Exiles. That would only come later thanks to this woman. Well, she was a New York-born poet named Emma Lazarus. Lazarus was commissioned in 1883 to write a poem to raise money for the Statue of Liberty. Well, Lazarus was from one of the oldest Jewish families in New York with roots that dated back to the 1650s. She was struggling with how to write a poem about the statue, especially one that you'd never laid eyes on. Well, she'd been working with many of the Jewish immigrants who had already flooded New York, and because of the statue stood in the harbor where most of the immigrants would arrive, Lazarus got the idea, well, maybe the statue should become a welcome beacon, calling people and welcoming them to over to America to start a new life. So she wrote the poem called The New Colossus. And interestingly, the poem did not gain notoriety when it was first written in 1883. It was actually not until the year 1906 when this plaque was first affixed to the inside of the Statue of Liberty. But what's more interesting is that Lazarus never saw the Statue of Liberty completed. She was traveling at the time in Europe, where she became ill with leukemia. And then a few months later, she was very sick and she sailed back to New York, but she was actually bedridden and too sick to raise her head to see the Statue of Liberty as she sailed by it. Well, she died a few months afterwards, never having seen the finished statue. However, her legacy to the statue still lives on today. And if you had signed on earlier and were listening to the music, there's a couple of songs that have taken the Give Me Your Tired, Your Poor, Your Huddled Masses Yearning to Breathe Free. They've actually set those words to music, and it's very beautiful. I played 2 different pieces using those words. So let's take a look inside the Statue of Liberty for those of you who've never seen it. In the chat box, it'd be interesting if you want to type down there how many of you actually have been inside the Statue of Liberty. Just say, let us know if you've been inside. But from the base of the statue to the very top, there are 377 steps, of which 146 steps from the pedestal to the crown are on a narrow double spiral staircase. So this spiral staircase goes up and goes down at the same time. They pass. It's a unique staircase that was built so you could only have one staircase, but you could go up and come down. The stairs are very narrow. They're only 18 inches in width, and the staircase has only a head clearance of 6 feet. So here's what it looks like inside the face of the statue. On the left, you can see the indentations where the nose and the lips are. You can see that the lips at the bottom, kind of in the shape of the lips, and then how they're bolted on. The bottom right, you'll see a ladder going into the arm. The upper right photo shows a bit of the armature and the details of how the skin was attached to the interior. All of this was done with bolts. It was just amazing. They did all of this by hand. So here's a look inside the crown. You know, people always ask, is it worth going all the way up to the top of the crown? I see a couple of the people say that they made it up to the top of the crown. That's a lot of stairs. I don't know that I would want to climb 377 stairs. They'd probably have to take me down on the emergency elevator. If it's on your bucket list, you know, maybe you should do it. But the thing is, when you get all the way up there, there really isn't much of a view. It relates to some symbolism that we talk about. We'll talk about in just a few minutes regarding the Statue of Liberty. But as you recall, the original name of the statue was Liberty Enlightening the World. And this is one of the reasons that the statue is not facing New York City. A lot of people never realize this, but the statue is actually facing out into the Atlantic Ocean with the idea that the light from her torch in the crown would be a symbol of the rays of sun, and she would be shining her light across the ocean and around the world to places where people are not yet living in freedom. So when you get up there, you know, you really can't see a good view of New York City because of how it's. But you have to go all the way to one side to get a view, and you can actually look down and look at the Keystone that she's holding in her left hand, and sometimes let's see. There was a picture. I guess it's probably covered with my chat screen and I can't see it. Hold on. You seeing? Yep, you can see it on the upper picture on the upper right hand. The little bird up there. You get to see some of the wildlife. This is actually a falcon that's in the upper right hand photo. So you never know what you're going to see when you get up there. So symbolisms, there's a lot of symbolisms that were, you know, associated with a Statue of Liberty. As you approach the statue, either from the ferry boat or you walk around the island, you'll notice that the statue is not standing flat-footed. Her right foot is actually behind her left foot, and she's raising it up as though she's striding forward. Well, this was done intentionally. In fact, she was striding forward as if the chains which came out from underneath the robe were to be breaking apart. And this was a symbol of that she's stepping out of tyranny or out of oppression into liberty and into freedom. As you recall earlier, we talked about de la Belle wanting to celebrate the end of slavery in the United States, and this was his way of doing so. So it symbolized the breaking of chains and the breaking of shackles. Your profile covers the photos. I'm not sure. Profile. I didn't think I had my picture on. So I think if you go up to view in the upper right hand corner, and you can take care of it that way. Okay, so here's a picture of the Keystone. Well, most people think she's holding a tablet. If you ask them, they say, what's she holding? They'll say she's holding a tablet. Well, it's actually a keystone. And what is a keystone? Well, you'll note that two of the notches at the very top, which will tell you that it's a keystone. And a keystone is the last piece that goes into a structure that holds the entire thing together. And written on the keystone is probably the most important date to Americans in Roman numerals, July 4th, 1776. So the intention that Bartholdi, the sculptor, had was that the adoption of the Declaration of Independence that was the keynote to the entire concept of liberty. Without those actions of our Americans' founding fathers on July 4th of 1776, the entire concept of liberty would crumble. So it would not be, it would not stand on its own. So that's why that even most people think it's a tablet. It's actually a keystone, and it was that was the intent of the design. Oh shoot, this thing is sticking again. Hold on. All right. We talked about the crown and the torch and how they were meant to symbolize enlightening the world, shining the light across the light of liberty across the ocean. But the crown has another piece of symbolism as well. If you count the number of points on the crown, how many are there? 7. This symbolizes that there are 7 continents in the world, there's 7 seas, and there were 7 wonders. Bertholdi was a big fan of the 7 wonders of the world, so he threw that in there as well. The continents were meant to symbolize that even though the statue was a gift from France to the United States, it was actually meant to symbolize that it was a symbol to the entire world, all 7 continents. I didn't know that before. That was kind of an interesting thing I learned. We mentioned the torch, which was a very interesting part of history. So let me ask you a question. Now there's 2 images here of the torch you'll see right now. Type in the chat box which one you think is the original torch for the Statue of Liberty. Is it the one on the left or the one on the right? Any guesses? Everybody see those? Right, everybody's typing in the right. Yep, everybody's coming in with on the right. Oh, one person said the gold one. On the right. Well, the correct answer is both. The one on the right hand is the original torch of the Statue of Liberty. Although that's not what it originally looked like when it arrived here in New York. It looked more like the torch on the left. Bertholdi's idea was actually how the torch would look today with gold leaf painted on top. That's what he envisioned, and it would be illuminated from the outside. However, when the torch arrived in the port in 1886, the committee didn't think that it was giving off enough light, especially if it was in the harbor. They thought it should act like more of a like a lighthouse, and so they were expecting it to give off more light. So a row of windows was added in 1886, and then another row was added in 1892. However, from the photo on the right-hand side, they started to add more windows, and it was entirely illuminated later from the inside. Well, the image on the right was actually from 1916. And that was the year that the Black Tom explosion took place in New York Harbor. That was a big explosion that was actually part of a sabotage by the German agents who destroyed U.S.-made munitions that were to be supplied to their allies in World War I. And that explosion, which occurred on July 30th in 1916 in New York Harbor, killed 4 people and destroyed some $20 million worth of military goods. Well, this incident, which happened prior to the U.S. entering the World War I, also damaged the Statue of Liberty. It was one of the largest artificial non-nuclear explosions in history. And it was actually the torch that was damaged the most at that time by shrapnel from the explosion. So you can see here the original design with the gold leaf painted on the top of the copper. That was the way that that it was supposed to be, and that's the way that the designer had designed it. Well, this man was hired, Gutson Borglum. He was a famous sculptor. Many of you might recognize him because he designed Mount Rushmore. Well, he made one fatal error in his design. He designed it with glass, and the glass pieces were not airtight or watertight. So for the next 70 years, salt water seeped into the torch and the arm of the Statue of Liberty. And then when the restoration effort started in 1980, they took a look at the entire statue and they did a determination of the structure. They found that the arm and the torch were too badly corroded and there was too much damage and they couldn't be fixed. So the torch in the arm had to be replaced. Well, the torch was taken off of the Statue of Liberty and brought inside, where it's actually on display now. The torch was taken off the Statue of Liberty, and it was quite a process how they had to get it off. You can see at that time they used scaffolding, and they did bring the torch down with big cranes. And there's actually a video on YouTube if you're curious and want to go on, and you can watch them taking that torch down. Well, they went about recreating the new torch using the exact same methods as the original sculptor Bartholdi used to make the new torch. In fact, it was built in Paris and it was sent over to the United States, as was the original torch. And these are pictures of the torch that was removed and is now on display in the Statue of Liberty Museum. Well, another question for you. Which of these images is real? Is the real Statue of Liberty face? The one on the left or the one on the right? I promise you it's not both this time. Any ideas which one is the original? One person, Carol says it's on the right, the right. Brent says, Sandra, right. And you are correct. The one on the left is actually from New York Casino in Las Vegas, but somebody forgot to tell the U.S. Postal Service about that. The image that they used was from the New York statue, not the real one in New York. Nobody even noticed it until 2001, and when an actual stamp collector was looking through and he realized that's not the right Statue of Liberty. So the original sculptor of the New York Hotel statue sued the federal government and won a judgment of $3.5 million. The Postal Service had actually already printed 3.5 billion stamps with the wrong image. And so they had to stop selling those, and they were ordered to pay the 3.5 million plus interest to the hotel sculptor. That was a little bit of interesting trivia. So how many replicas are there around the world of the Statue of Liberty? Over 300, and it's covered, I can't read it, 325. But there's over 180 in the US alone. There's 42 in France. There's 8 in Canada. And those are the ones that are known. There's probably others around. These are in a few of the statues in Paris, you'll see. The most famous is on an island near the Eiffel Tower, is shown in the top center. This is actually one of the more interesting photos of the Statue of Liberty. If you look very close, it's 15,000 soldiers all assembled during World War I in the shape of the Statue of Liberty in a fort in Iowa. I believe it was Camp Dodge in Iowa. But if you look really close, you can see those are all men, soldiers, all lined up in the shape of the Statue of Liberty. Well, here's some different replicas of the statue found around the world. Everything from shopping malls, amusement parks, even Legoland in Denmark, the one at the top. But I do want to call your attention to an image at the bottom right-hand corner. This was a replica of the Statue of Liberty that was built in Warsaw, Poland. And it was built by Poland as a way of saying thank you to the United States for getting involved during the war. And of course, you can see other statues of liberty all around New York, Times Square. You can get up close and personal. They'll be happy to pose for you for a slight fee. Of course, nothing beats visiting the real Statue of Liberty in New York City. Well, while they may not be twins, the two statues do look similar. And the smaller version of the Statue of Liberty is a gift from France. It's being sent over to the United States. They created 11 of these in this original cast. And just like the older Lady Liberty, this is the little sister. It's headed to America. I believe it might be here already. This is, they say that it was a really important a statue to remind us of the strong links with France today. And after meeting her big sister in New York City, the little Lady Liberty is actually going to go to Washington, D.C. and take its home in the French embassy for the next 10 years. So that's where she'll be. And that's a little bit about the Statue of Liberty. Hopefully you have learned some new insights. I will give you my email address there. If you have any questions and you would like to email me, feel free to do that. We have our next presentation coming up on August 9th. As I said, we have quite a variety of programs, and next year I'm really working on a whole lineup of everything from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to a living life, living an Amish life. It's a whole variety. We live here in Sharon Springs, New York, so we're going to be focusing on some local history, how to grow hops. But the next one coming up here is the Civil War Diaries of Lieutenant William Hill. It's being presented by Ted Short. He's a local historian, and he's very, very knowledgeable in the Civil War, so I'm sure you'll gain some interesting things. Here's a list of the upcoming programs that you'll get to see. Those of you that are familiar with Sharon Springs, we have a very big Jewish history here, and one of my neighbors here actually grew up. He's Jewish, but he grew up owning a Jewish boarding house, and he has tremendous stories to share. I'll be talking about one of our big hotels up here, the Adler Hotel, from heyday to present day, showing some rarely seen home movies from the 1920s and 1930s. Yeah, we'll be talking about Pete Lindemann is a local historian that's got some great stories. He's written a book called They Made Just to Found James Tanner's Legs, and he's going to be talking about some of those. We'll be on November talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy 58 years later. That's going to be a very interesting step-by-step detailed story. And then in December, we're going to be talking about the history of Santa Claus. So again, great lineup of programs for the rest of the year. And then we'll be looking for twice as many next year. If you're interested in joining the Historical Society or getting our newsletter, I'm sending out an email after this presentation. This presentation is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the presentation. And on that page, you will also have a link to our newsletter. We put out newsletters quarterly. Just put out a new one, and you'll be able to go on and read our newsletters as well. But here's how you can contact us at the Sharon Historical Society. There's our email address, our phone number, and we want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. If you have questions, we're a little bit over time, but I'll hang around for a little bit. If anybody had any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Doesn't look like we have any, but thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate the time that you take with us. We've really, as I said, grown a lot with the Historical Society. We've doubled in our membership this year. It's been a great opportunity for us with these programs, and so we're really thrilled that you're a part of it. And thank you again. And I will be sending out links to future presentations. If you join this production, you will get automatically get emails of future ones. So thank you, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.